And I'm Lisa.
And this is the Paid Media Playbook, where we talk to marketing professionals about their challenges, tactics, and triumphs.
Join us here at Double Z Media for weekly conversations about media strategies for marketing leaders. Evan, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm excited to chat with you.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we get started in our deeper conversations about paid media, would you give our audience just a little overview about, your background?
Sure. Yeah, I've been in digital marketing for over a decade, and I started dabbling with paid media experimentation for a few clients when I was at a consultancy in like 2014 to 2017 kind of range. And I really enjoyed building like strong experimentation frameworks into paid media programs. And I know we're going to talk about that some today. I left that consultancy, became an AI startup before it was cool. It would crush it right now, but it was too early. And then I left that for Convoy, where I ran paid web and SEO for a year and a half. And then Airwallex, where I ran growth marketing for the US. So a variety of channels. And then Syncery for a year and a half, where I ran paid web, SEO, kind of mix, as well as worked with SDRs really closely. And now head of marketing at Service Bell, which is the all-bound strategy platform for connecting, visitors on your website to our dialer, to video chat on the site, and to all your systems so you can follow up with them. And we use a lot of tactics for retargeting off of those lists and that kind of thing. So still in the paid media space with less of a budget now.
Awesome. Thank you. It sounds like you have an experience with a wide variety of different, sizes of businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the biggest business I've been a part of was Convoy, Airwallex, both around 1,200 people at the time. Convoy is defunct now, and Airwallex is, I think, still around 1,000 people or so. So I wouldn't say I have large enterprise experience, but definitely like tiny startups to the unicorn type growth stage. Yeah.
And what do you feel is one of the reasons maybe that you would, at like a startup, start a paid media campaign? What do businesses need to have have in place to feel good about spending money and driving traffic somewhere?
Yeah, I think there are a few things to point out about advertising as a channel, as a strategy, as a model for going to market that are worth sort of like first principles consideration. One is that everything you do to get in front of customers costs money. It could be your time that could be spent on something else. It could be that you're paying someone for their time, a sales rep, right? And they go and get in front of people. So advertising is actually a surprisingly cheap way to get in front of people with the right channels, with the right targeting, right? All the caveats that go with it. But when you think about when I promote a LinkedIn post that I post now, because they have that cool feature, and you think that I can drop $100 behind it and get that post in front of 10,000 more of my target ICP, ideal customer profile, it's kind of amazing where you think the hours it would take to accomplish the same thing. And even then, if I tried to email 1,000 people or LinkedIn 1,000 people, I would be kicked off LinkedIn, or it would take a month, and I would probably get marked as spam. There are limitations and benefits to any channel that we use for getting the word out. I think often advertising gets a bad rap in post zero interest rate startup world, where people are now thinking about efficiency all the time. Ad budgets have disappeared from the world I'm in of B2B software. There's an aversion to it now. And I'm a little confounded by that, given what I just mentioned about how everything costs money.
Yeah, you got to buy your audiences really one way or the other, right? And
absolutely.
It's easier and have consistency. Can't just depend on someone picking up your story, right? Like, I hope someone writes about us in GeekWire.
That's true. Yeah, PR is a good example of how that doesn't work. How many people will put out a press release, pay $700 to $5,000 for it just to go out on the wire, and then be like, why is no one covering this? Because there's 10 million of those every day or something ridiculous. But that's an exaggeration, to be sure. But
even if they do, it's like it's a one-time thing.
Yeah.
It's just that one, and yes, maybe other people will see it, but I mean, I've noticed it doesn't necessarily move the needle unless you have
Yeah,
lots of things going out there.
absolutely. Yeah, I think the other thing that founders need to consider, or just GTM leaders, go-to-market leaders, marketing sales,
Mhm.
chief revenue officer need to consider when they're thinking about should we invest in paid media is what things about your growth trajectory do you not know yet? What is still unknown? What variables have you not been able to pin down? A good example could be messaging, but I think it's often given too much attention. Messaging is really tough because it's easy to run tests on, but it's really hard to build words in a way that are testable, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Now, an audience targeting, that's a really good place to look at advertising for segmenting and testing different audiences against each other for responsiveness. Throw 10 messages at the market, put $5,000 behind each message on a LinkedIn ad. Make sure LinkedIn Audience Network is off so you don't, that's their pressure release valve for sending you to junk so they don't have a overpressured buying marketplace. And you'll come back with click-through rates and conversion rates and engagement rates from both audiences and be able to make a decision at the top of the organization for which direction to take your product. Simple experiments like that I have built for Esri, Kodak, Xerox, Haibu, the companies that I've been part of as well. And people are always struck by the level of variability, the difference between audience A and audience B and how responsive they are to your product you're offering.
We ran a campaign similar to that for a client last summer, and my favorite report I ever made, because they had three different audiences and three different messages that were tailored for each audience, and that was
Mm-hmm.
not the audience that actually responded best to each message. So just the
Interesting.
amount of information we were able to share back with like, well, I know you think that audience A likes this concept delivered to them,
Yeah.
but maybe we should go back to the drawing board a little bit.
Yeah. I gave this recommendation on LinkedIn when someone asked about we have two web pages and two variants of the same web page and we're not sure which one to publish. Any ideas for testing this cost effectively? And I gave this suggestion. Well, same audience, send them the words that you're not sure about and see which one engages. And often what happens is there's no answer. That's fine. That means it doesn't matter. Pick one and go with it. Or, yeah, exactly. Like a hypothesis, they all thought this was the better one, and that maybe it was too convoluted, too esoteric, too jargonated, whatever reason that it just doesn't land with the audience, and you go with the simpler version. It is surprising. And I'm always surprised how rarely, so it's great to hear that you guys are, how rarely agencies are participating in these kinds of experimentation efforts, right? Because they're more work. They're, less media out the door, a lot more time analyzing, preparing, and evaluating campaigns.
I think it's the only way to stay competitive with, for our clients. Like if we weren't doing that, I don't know, we wouldn't last very long, I feel.
I
Because
think
they
that's
are,
fair.
well, I feel like we work with marketing directors mostly. So, I mean, they're focused on messaging. We're focused on metrics, but
Mhm.
that is such a passion for a marketing director, right? Their
Mhm.
whole thing is my brand and how do I get these messages? I mean, at the end of the day, that's what they feel like they're really in charge of, right? Like
Mhm.
what that
Yeah.
looks like. So if we can help them, make decisions because it is scary and
Mhm.
you can be in a silo.
Absolutely. It also is the only way marketers really get to talk to their market. I think.
Mhm.
I mean, there are surveys and research groups, but ultimately at scale in a non, those
Exactly.
have the problem of, the observation effect where
Mhm.
people act differently when they know you're watching them.
Yep.
But advertising, that's in the wild. A couple times I've created fake brands, fake Facebook pages for a brand and advertised to it, that brand to people, and surprisingly not illegal because we're not actually having them buy anything and just use the click-through rates to see like, okay, who did this land with the most, and basically give these companies that had not launched yet a roadmap to where to go, who wants it, what to say.
Yeah, and so
Um,
much less expensive than a like couple of $10,000 focus groups or something. You know what I mean?
yes, absolutely. That budget just pivoted into a campaign is much more effective. Yeah. Yeah, I think this also ties to how often people have budgets that they have no idea if they're having meaningful impact. And that might be because systems aren't talking. That might be because they inherited the campaigns and the agencies, and they're sort of left to decide, like, should I fire them and start fresh and have more control over the process end to end, or is it fine? And I think I would give the same recommendation, is ask them to help you design and launch an experimentation group. And even if you don't want to cut the entire budget, so you take 20% of your budget and put it into these little experimentation pods. That's what we did a lot at Convoy, where we had a larger portfolio, a larger budget. And I was able to make the case for LinkedIn advertising, which they'd never done before. And this was kind of in the heyday of LinkedIn advertising. And eventually, through experimenting with a small modicum of budget, it actually became much more productive than Google AdWords, and was the highest driver of opportunities of pipeline behind our outbound, the sales development representatives doing the prospecting. So that incubation concept, with like clear lines in the sand of experimentation, control of variables, and knowledge of why you're testing something and what is testing. It also means you have to be very disciplined, right, about holding constant messages and not messing with, things you're not testing. That's the way to build successful programs, I think. I don't really know another way.
One thing that I've seen clients do before is they try to test something that's too small. I don't know if you've run into this, where they'll have their two different creatives or their two different messages, and the difference between them is minuscule, like almost unnoticeable unless you were looking for it. And I've run into it before where I've tried to then come up with the reporting story afterwards of, I guess people liked this shade of blue better. I don't know.
Yeah. I think there's a common misconception that small tweaks make a big difference. Okay. Caveat would be, like, I know with wine bottles, right? They found that if this has been like studied a crazy amount, that if you put the pricing above the wine bottle versus below, it completely flips our perception of value. If it's above the wine bottle, we think it's really expensive. It's below the wine bottle, we think it's great value. It's on a platform. I don't know why. Humans are weird, right? But I also don't think each brand needs to become that sort of research science team, right? And it's not really sustainable in the long term. Whereas, the question, like, what should we be testing first and foremost, needs to be at the forefront of every strategy conversation about advertising, right? Small tweaks might make a difference, but are they going to make the biggest difference? It's really unlikely. Even colors, I often push back against color testing. I know it's really popular. Color science is fun. I don't know how accurate it is. And the idea that, like, I haven't seen color directly impede the ability of an ad to convert or not convert someone, as long as they can clearly see and understand the message, and it was meant for them, designed for them, clearly for them, attaches to some attribute or signal about them that resonates. I mean, I think that's the primary driver of people to engage with advertising.
Tell that to the art director, though.
Yes, right. Yeah. I mean, I think they have a role to play in helping stabilize clarity through communication. I think accessibility and clarity are undervalued often in top art departments, and often people just can't read something or don't know, like, it sounds weird. Sounds too over designed,
Right.
over engineered.
Yep. That's absolutely where they come in and really help, and have confidence in that too. They have the confidence to go, no, this needs to be this way, versus somebody going, I don't know. They're like, no, I know, I've done this for a long time. This works.
Yeah. Yeah. And also finding ways to stand out from the crowd, right? Like, the one big caveat to this experimentation framework concept is, if you can find something all your competitors are not doing and it gets noticed, maybe it is all your competitors have red and white and black brand colors, and you choose something very inverse of that. But a better example might be, like, HubSpot in the early days went so, like, die on the hill of simplicity versus Salesforce, right? And look what's happened. Like, they didn't have all the Salesforce features. They're getting there. They still don't quite, but it doesn't matter. Most people still value simplicity of use over freedom of feature set. So I think that brands can often find a way to tell a story or get in front of a user that is just utterly unique, makes you notice. I remember an ad in the Super Bowl that was a whistling. The only audio was whistling with snapping of the Robin Hood theme song or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
I won't whistle it because that probably translate terribly. But then it was just like big letters on, I think it was T-Mobile or something. They were good at this kind of thing. Big letters on screen, right? And I read the whole thing. I was like, oh, it's not an obnoxious talk tracked ad. I think we often get caught off guard by creative where it comes in a way of breaking the norm of media.
I actually got my degree in that. And I think what my professor had said to me was my favorite thing. He said, basically, if you're not violating expectations, you're not doing it right. And everything had to violate expectations. But I liked it because it was a word that really takes you like past any, anything. It's like kind of getting it and going, but yeah.
Yeah, I think Mad Men actually had a lot of instances where that was illustrated well, right? I know the first episode, women suggest that in the research team suggests that leaning into the chance that you might die from smoking a cigarette is actually an angle they could take. They chose not to, but I think point taken. Like, it's surprising how often, particularly if you don't need everyone to love you, you need
living on the edge.
Yeah, exactly. A core niche audience to love you. Yeah.
Well, out of these, huge variety of different clients and their different needs, what would you say the differences and challenges between a client with a very small budget versus a client with a very big budget?
I think primarily how much you can test, how many experiments you can afford to run, which means that in a small budget framework, you need to know very, very well what questions are most pressing to the business and what insight will be most valuable. And you need to hold that budget so loosely that even if it disappears overnight and you get nothing back, you will not cry yourself to sleep.
Right.
Small budgets should be only deployed when you have a clear reason for experimenting in mind. Otherwise, you're only praying that the perfect campaign launched once will somehow magically boost revenues.
But we've got an A/B test. We've got to. Okay. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah. I think that often sometimes there are last gasp efforts around advertising where people expect that this is going to be the thing that turns the ship around. And then it's not usually the case. It's usually something about the offering, the product, something more core to the business that needs to be solved before you consider advertising. And then often for teams that do have small budgets and are in a growth trajectory, they're doing well, the company's healthy, the product's great, they get lazy with advertising. And so it gets hidden, like growth hides a lot of things, right?
Yeah.
For a long time. And then all of a sudden, Silicon Valley Bank collapse. First thing that goes is your paid budget because you have no proof that any of it meant anything to the business.
Trackability is always like the most important aspect, but also the biggest hurdle, I feel like, in trying to get things set up with a new client. What is their KPI? What is their key performance indicator actually? And how can we track it meaningfully?
Yeah. And I think that, you guys, I imagine, work with a lot more business to consumer scenarios than I do. I often think about ways to measure and attribute success around these experiments that are agnostic to link-based tracking, which is absolutely vital in an e-commerce scenario, of course. But if you're dealing with retail or any sort of disconnected business model from the advertising, then time box your experiment cohorts, right? One runs for 2 weeks, you give a week off, and then you run another one for 2 weeks, and you see what the near-term impact is.
Yeah, any lift in anything.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's pretty common knowledge, I'm aware. I think the thing that seems still foreign among marketing in general from the conversations I've had over the last few years is just how to build a good experimentation framework around like what should be experimented for, what should be tested. I actually learned this all from my mom, who's a biology teacher and high school biology teacher, but she almost had her PhD, I should mention.
That's exactly my dad, by the way. He was
no way.
school, taught college, almost got his PhD in entomology, actually, but anyway, that's funny. Yeah.
That is funny. Yeah, and she just was able to instill in me this idea of like controlling for variables is like a skill, because if you don't, then your experiment doesn't matter at all. Yeah.
Sure.
I guess.
Well, it is, I would say, I'm thinking about like traditional media and, how it is measured. And you definitely have to have it's been really hard, actually. It's been really hard. We do awareness campaigns. So there is
Mhm.
really nothing like you just have to, we've done surveys after pre and post surveys
Mhm.
and that sort of thing, if it's a huge campaign. And that was like, the only thing we could do is basically brand recognition over, have you
Mhm.
heard of this? Because we've done like government initiatives and things, and
Mm.
it's
I
just,
yeah, I
yeah.
remember using back when it was more popular, social listening technology, Brandwatch, NetBase, Infigi Atlas. I tried and used a lot of those different tools, published a few pieces evaluating them, and sometimes we would use those to help like Verizon Wireless or Macy's kind
Mm-hmm.
of scan the market before and after certain efforts. And if you've got a brand that has some scale to it, right, you can get some good things out of it. If you've got newer, younger brands or just really niche brands, though, no one's talking about them in the way they want to be talked about
Right.
generally.
Evan, thank you so much for joining us. But before we let you go, I do have one final question. What is one piece of advice you would like to give your early career self?
That's a great question. Get really good at documenting assumptions and hypotheses and being clear that everything you're doing, communicating that around to an organization, everything you're doing is because of those assumptions and hypotheses. What I often find is if I say I'm doing this, it can get challenged really easily by a senior leader, by a peer. If I have already communicated, though, what I have assumed and what I have hypothesized, then we can talk about those aspects and get clarity and alignment a lot more quickly and easily rather than sort of start off on an argument and, oh, hey, well, I actually thought I was going to
Yeah.
do that because of this.
Sort of bringing the
Someone,
problem to them so that it's everybody's idea at that point, right?
yeah. Yeah, and typically senior leaders have 1,000 assumptions in their own heads that they haven't written down. And, that's okay as long as when I write down my assumptions and they see it, they say, oh, that's not true. Or, I actually thought this was different. Oh, we're not making any money from that product. I thought it was our flagship, that kind of thing.
Gotcha. That's good.
Absolutely.
That's good advice. Totally.
Wish I would have done it sooner.
All right. Well, thank you again so much. This has been a fantastic conversation. It was really great talking to you and learning about your expertise and a little more on the B2B side than I work with on the day-to-day.
Yep.
Well, great. Hope you guys have a great weekend. And thanks again for having me on.
Thanks for listening to the Paid Media Playbook. Want more content like this? Follow our agency, Double Z Media, on LinkedIn. You can find the link in the episode description.